Hello, I'm John Fenn, Head of Research and Programs at the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, and I'd like to welcome you to today's presentation, which is part of our ongoing Benjamin A. Botkin Lecture Series. Before we begin, I'd like to start by acknowledging that the Library of Congress, located near the confluence of the Potomac and the Anacostia Rivers, is built on land that is part of the homelands of the Nacotchtank, Piscataway, Conoy, Pamunkey, and Manahoac people. Indigenous peoples, including members of these nations, still live and practice their teachings and cultures here today. The library honors these stewards of the land and all the indigenous peoples of the United States who are the first peoples, including those in the region where the library now provides its services. The library works to interact with these groups in a responsible and respectful way. The Botkin Lectures allows us to highlight the work of leading scholars in the disciplines of folklore, ethnomusicology, oral history, and cultural documentation, while enhancing the collections here at the American Folklife Center. For both the center and the library, the Botkin Lectures form an important facet of our acquisition activities. Each lecture is captured to video and will become part of the center's resources. This lecture, like the others in the Botkin series, will then be posted to the library's website, where it will be available to patrons throughout the world. So now would be an excellent time to turn off your phones so you don't get captured to video. Thanks. Today, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Benjamin Harbert, a distinguished scholar, educator, and ethnomusicologist who is professor of music and chair of the Performing Arts Department at Georgetown University. Dr. Harbert is author of the recent book, Instrument of the State, A Century of Music in Louisiana's Angola Prison on Oxford University Press. And his book, and Follow Me Down, his recent documentary on the same topic, will be the subject of today's talk. And I will say there are flyers for the book available on the back table and in the foyer up there. Our bookstore was not able to get the book, which is a good sign. It's been sold out at the distributor, so congrats, Ben, on that. But go ahead and get a copy. Angola Prison was built in 1901 by the state of Louisiana on a former slave plantation. Throughout the years, Angola has played a significant and complex role in America's musical history. Harbert's research chronicles many of the musicians and bands active in Angola over the decades and shows how music was and is a vital resource for those imprisoned there. That resource, however, is conditional, as the administration also uses music and control of music and music making for its own purposes. As we will hear, the history of this musical dialogue offers a unique perspective on incarceration, politics, and the development of music in the 20th century American South. Let me close by noting that the American Folklife Center Archive is a repository for a significant amount of the important field recordings and research collections documenting music in Angola that have been done over the years, and that Dr. Harbert's own collection has recently been accessioned by the American Folklife Center. In fact, at this very moment, materials from his collection are on view over in the Madison Building as part of the library's new acquisitions display. And since materials from your collection are currently in the Adams Building as well, Ben, it looks like you are filling up your LOC bingo card by being in all three buildings at once. So I want to thank you all for joining us here today, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Harbert.
Sean, thanks a lot. It's really an honor to be here. I've known of this series for a long time, and it's quite surreal to be at the podium here. Nancy, thanks so much. Jesse, and all this. So I'm going to read, and a lot of this is adapted from the book. John failed to mention that the book, I brought the author's discount flyer, so 30% off. But please don't be a stranger if you want to follow up. I'm accessible. As a musician, collaboration is at the heart of my method, and this extends to my research and my filmmaking. When creating my documentary, Follow Me Down, I worked closely with incarcerated musicians to plan and execute the production. And similarly, while writing this book, I shared drafts with musicians at Angola during the peer review process with Oxford. And my aim was to create a meaningful work that resonated with their experiences, rather than simply telling their stories or claiming sole authority over the history of music at the prison. So in this talk, I'll share my unfolding understanding of the relationship between music and incarceration. Through my own process of research and collaboration, I came to a deeper understanding of both prison and the music incarcerated musicians have cultivated there. My interest in incarceration and music began much longer before I set foot at Angola. When I was little, rummaging through my parents' record collection, I stumbled upon this album that lodged itself in my imagination. It's Josh White's Chain Gang Songs, released on Elektra Records in 1958. The cover art was striking, and I was mystified. What could music possibly have to do with those shackles? The juxtaposition seemed almost paradoxical. I may not have even listened to the record. The cover presented enough for me to wonder, how could something as liberating and as expressive as music coexist with the brutal reality of a chain gang? Fast forward 15 years from my childhood encounter with Josh White's album, and I found myself running the guitar department at the Old Town School of Folk Music in Chicago. And I was tasked with revising their songbook. I was adding backstories to 117 folk songs, and I hoped that the backstories would help redirect students who came in to learn a Coldplay or a Third Eye Blind tune towards more traditional fare like Dink Song or Pretty Sorrow. As I researched the histories behind these folk songs, I was struck with how many of them came from prisons. Much of the material I was working with had been collected by the father-son folklorist team John and Alan Lomax during their trips through the Southeast United States in the 1930s. And much of it was cataloged right here, as John said, in the American Folklife Center. The prevalence of prisons as a seeming origin point for American music was a surprising discovery for me. Having studied a wide range of global music traditions, Indonesian gamelan, African drumming, Indian music, Turkish music, Egyptian music, I'm not bragging, I swear, Spanish music, I knew that other cultures didn't have such a concentration of their folk repertoire generated in prisons. Many of these songs I was discovering here from the US songbook were already familiar to me, but in different guises. I knew Midnight Special from Creedence Clearwater Revival's rock rendition, and also Lead Belly's classic recording, which I discovered in a Smithsonian compilation album when I was on my way to college and we stopped in DC, so thanks to the Smithsonian. Black Betty was recognizable from the 70s rock group Ram Jam and countless TV soundtracks. And Goodnight Irene was a standard for my grandparents' generation. It was always something I could play and get my grandparents' friends to sing along with. But as I discovered the original field recordings of these songs, those recorded in the prisons, I was struck by the raw poetry that emerged from the collision of music and the audible grain of incarceration, the tension between freedom and constraint. John Lomax, in his book, American Ballads and Folk Songs, evokes this poetry in his description of his section on chain gang songs, a whole chapter of the book. It's Lomax's words. No stanza is ever sung the same way as another. The Negroes play with the melody and the rhythm, vary them, keep silent, burst out suddenly, and impose a great variety of ornament and original deviation from the pattern of the tune. But the whole is dominated and swept along by the heavy rhythm of the hose. In this way, the songs should be sung. It is in this way that the songs should be sung. Get the wham, wham, wham out of the big splay feet, the axes, the hose, firmly and heavily in mind. Open your mouth and shout the songs. They are not gentle or sedate or subtle. They are the work songs of driven, despairing men who sing about their troubles to be rid of them. But maybe it's not poetry. And I should admit that I have a deep-seated distrust for poets. Ralph Ellison, a contemporary of Alan Lomax's, might call music in prison, quote, freedom within unfreedom. And Ellison might not have considered prison song poetry either. As he wrote of the blues, he might call it, quote, an impulse to keep the painful details and episodes of a brutal experience alive in one's aching consciousness, to finger its jagged grain and to transcend it. Catastrophe expressed lyrically. Ellison, in fact, might call it jazz. But as I began to think more about prison music, America grappled with the catastrophe of mass incarceration. In the 1990s, when I was doing the revision of the songbook, The incarcerated population in the US increased dramatically, with Louisiana having the highest incarceration rate in the country. To me, these numbers felt disconnected from the recordings at the prison farm and of the Chain Gang song. And I'll play a song that Harry Oster had recorded on the left, and you can look at the image on the right and get a sense of this disconnect I felt.
Ring 'em on the devil, let your hammer ring. Oh, well, I ring for the governor, let your hammer ring. Oh, well, I ring for the governor, let the hammer ring. We got to ring 'em all day long, hammer ring. We got to ring 'em all day long, hammer ring.
This disconnect led me to a fundamental question, or set of questions, that emerged from the gaps between this song and mass warehousing. What does music have to do with prison today? How did the relationship between incarceration and music change as we moved into the age of mass warehousing? And what new forms of creativity, resistance, and survival sounded within the contemporary correctional facility? The gaps between the historical prison songs and the contemporary reality of mass incarceration affected the way that I researched this book, about 100 years of music at Angola. I attended to the discontinuities and also the continuities of how musicians managed prison. And I'm grateful for the preservation of the music testimony of state power that we have in archives like this one here at Library of Congress. The songs preserved a musical document of older Southern prisons, revealing certain continuities that persisted over time. For instance, the disproportionate incarceration of African Americans, for example, could be traced back to the very foundations of the American carceral system, enshrined in the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution. But music, in response to this, has made a persistent claim to citizenship over time. But it was the discontinuities between these musical artifacts and the modern prison industrial complex that I found the most perplexing and ultimately the most illuminating. Discontinuities showed me that prison changes over time and that it's not always logical. Attending to the discontinuities had the effect of denaturalizing the prison itself. In other words, I began to see the historical ness of the prison. I began to see the prison as a historical institution rather than a timeless or inevitable one. It could not be understood as logical, it could not be understood as necessary response to crime. Seeing it historically revealed it as a product of certain economic, certain ideological, and certain political forces. Contingent factors that has shaped its messy transformation over time. So a little bit about Angola to set the stage. I chose Angola as the site to study the relationship between music and incarceration. And thanks to the Lomaxes and all the musicians who collaborated with them, there's more historical record of musicality at prison at Angola. In a way, Angola and the Library of Congress had generated a well-documented musical expression behind bars. Now, Angola itself is a vast institution. As John said, it's a plantation bought by the state of Louisiana in 1901 to move prisoners, mostly black, from the Baton Rouge Penitentiary to cotton and cane fields. A relic of slavery, it was divided into camps, each with its own work duties on the 18,000-acre plot framed in a bend of the Mississippi River on 3 sides. And on the 4th side, 26 miles of marsh rife with poisonous snakes and the occasional alligator. Today, it's the largest state prison in the US, and the annual rodeo draws thousands of tourists and highlights its dual nature as both a site of confinement and a spectacle for public consumption. Demographically, Angola has been overwhelmingly African American, black men making up around 85% of the population. Many serve life sentences for serious crimes, with little hope of ever being released. In fact, it's estimated that 90% of Angola's prisons will die there. Once notorious for its violence, now it touts a robust hospice program. At the time of my research, Louisiana still had the highest incarceration rate in the country, with a disproportionate impact on communities of color and poor communities. And while these facts and figures provide one way of understanding Angola, they don't fully capture the prison's essence as an institution. In other words, it's hard to study prison from afar. To understand Angola as a physical space and also as a social, political, and cultural institution, I needed engagement with lived experiences. And for me, I tend to relate best to other musicians anyway. So from 2008 to 2016, I filmed performances, recorded interviews, and to a lesser extent, played music with incarcerated musicians at Angola. I also conducted oral history interviews with long-term prisoners to trace the evolution of musical styles and practices over time, and to understand how changes in prison policy and American society had affected music. And I met incredible musicians with powerful stories, and here's a clip of the Pure Heart Messengers from my 2012 film, Follow Me Down.
My blessing all the way.
My blessing, y'all.
My blessing all the way.
I'm gonna get mine.
I'm gonna get mine, gon' get it, gon' get mine.
I'm gonna get
I'm gonna get
mine.
mine, gon' get it, gon' get
I'm
mine.
gonna get mine.
I wanna get mine, gon' get it, gon' get mine.
I'm gonna get
I wanna get mine, gon' get it, gon' get mine.
There's a blessing.
There's a blessing in store for me.
There's a blessing, boy.
There's a blessing in store
You might
for
be
me.
riding your car.
There's a blessing in store
You might
for
be
me.
sitting home waiting on it.
There's a blessing
I'm gonna
in
tell
store
y'all
for
that.
me.
But I dare you.
There's a blessing in store for me.
I dare you, boy.
There's a
And
blessing
I dare
in
you
store for me.
to come on and praise Him.
There's a blessing in store for me.
'Cause my blessing,
My blessing on the way.
my blessing, y'all.
My blessing
I got to
on
go
the way.
well, I got a blessing.
My blessing on the way.
My blessing, y'all.
My blessing on the
I
way.
wanna get mine.
I'm gonna get mine, gon' get it, gon' get
I'm
mine.
gonna get
I'm gonna
mine.
get mine, gon' get it, gon' get
Say, I'm
mine.
gonna get mine.
I'm gonna get mine, gon' get it, gon' get mine.
I'm gonna
get mine, gon' get it, gon' get mine.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Wow for that. All right.
After making and screening the film, I wanted to know more. And as part of my 6 years of follow-up research, I interviewed more incarcerated musicians, went through the archives of the Angolite, a prison news magazine run by the prisoners themselves, and studied court documents, historical records, newspapers to understand better the history of musical practice there. I also spent countless hours at the American Folklife Center. This is starting to sound like a commercial. Here at the Library of Congress, listening to recordings and studying the correspondence of earlier researchers who had visited Angola. This provided an especially important, crucial point of comparison for my own work, nearly a century apart from the Lomax's work. And I'm honored to have the work here, and thank you, Jesse, for all your care, and thank you to my assistant, Julia Canamella, who helped archive all of this stuff. So here I want to show you first, if we're going to trace Angola's music through time, I'll show it to you through images, starting in 1901. This is what prison music at Angola looks like. Isn't that weird? So what is prison music? There are many ways of thinking about this question. My first attempt was to figure out why somebody would be compelled to make music there. Expression, escape, connection, nostalgia, aesthetic contemplation. But as soon as I started talking to incarcerated musicians, I realized that it was the wrong way to get to my original question. The answer to why they make music is simple. Prisoners play music in prison because musicians will play in almost any condition. Like most musicians anywhere, incarcerated musicians are motivated by a simple commitment to do it, a simple need to make music. They will make all kinds of excuses just to play and take advantage of any opportunity to do so. It makes me a better person. It benefits the community. You don't have to pay for an outside group. But really, these are just excuses to play music. So asking instead of why prisoners make music, but how prisoners make music in prison leads to a more fundamental question. What is prison? In my book, I identify 3 historical influences that have shaped the modern institution of Angola: outlawry, penance, and slavery. And each of these practices of punishment and control has left a distinct legacy on prison, influencing its culture, its policies, and the experiences of those confined there. Outlawry, or the condition of being out of law. Let's not romanticize it with Bonnie and Clyde here. It's the experience of not having the protection of law. It refers to the practice of legally placing somebody outside of the protections and entitlements of the law. It's a form of punishment with deep historical roots, encompassing practices such as banishment, exile, infamy, excommunication, and civil death. At its core, outlawry strips individuals of their humanity and creates categories of legal non-subjects. And in the context of Angola, the legacy of outlawry persists in this notion of, quote, lock them up and throw away the key. And in the prison's strict life sentencing policies, it lives on in the fields where harsh labor, overseen by trustees or prisoner guards, which served at Angola until 1978. In these spaces of civic blindness, the prison's power lies not in its ability to surveil constantly, but in the state's willingness to look away, to abandon its prisoners to the brutal conditions of the farm. So music in this context provides a vital function. If outlawry tears apart the social fabric, music can stitch together some of those pieces, creating improvised social activities. As an ethnomusicologist might explain, the body politic comes alive through participatory music. Now, it's important not to romanticize this dynamic. Many who worked in the fields in Angola in the 1960s told me the music was often overshadowed by abuse, trickery, fighting, and grueling labor. But in certain moments, singing could create a temporary we out of many isolated individuals. The second historical influence, penance, emerges with the rise of the penitentiary in the early to mid-19th century. And these massive New England institutions were designed to address white criminality through the process of moral reformation, the idea that a soul could be mortified, subjected to a temporary civil death, and then reborn into society. In practice, penitentiaries were often sites of brutal treatment, mental illness, and squalid conditions. But from 19th century perspective, they represented a humanitarian turn away from outlawry, public spectacle, and corporal punishment, and decrepit local jails. And in Angola, the penance can be heard in Bud Wilkerson's country songs performed by the band The Western Airs, who would play for the public in the 1970s with lyrics that plead for forgiveness, plead for redemption. I'll quote a song here. You know that you can have me whenever you want. Or if you don't want me at all, I'm yours, yours alone. I'm yours from now on. I'm yours at your beck and call. You know if you need me, I'll always be there. I'll be there. I have to crawl. These expressions of apology and submission and the country trope of looking in the mirror became a public performance of redemption. Finally, the plantation model, with its roots in slavery, continues to structure its life at Angola. Angola's history as a major plantation dates back to the mid-19th century, and its legacy can be seen in the prison's emphasis on agricultural production. The plantation logic at Angola periodically constrains the penitentiary-driven reform efforts. It shapes the system of prisoner jobs It saves the state money, and it blurs the line between prisoners and their keepers, as in the case of trusty inmate guards. So, music at Angola responds to this, and it's shaped by all three of these legacies. Imagine these as gravities or magnetic forces pulling on musicians, the institutions that they build and the agreements that they make. Gravities that alter the opportunities for making music. Again, musicians will find any excuse to play anywhere. So reforms, religious partnerships, budget cuts, public abandonment, the pressures of self-sustenance all affect the musical life of the prison as they shift within the competing multiple missions of the institution. So, outlawry, penance, and slavery don't explain why incarcerated musicians play music. They explain how musicians are able to play music, and that is what affects the sound of music inside and beyond the plantation. So as I researched eras of musicians, I listened longer than I ever had before. I listened to a whole century instead of listening to a single song. I listened longer than any single musician's lifespan. I listened to the sound of policy, economics, politics, and demographic change, and I came to this definition of what prison music is. Prison music is the organized sound of laws, policies, missions, and social consequences. Again, prison music is the organized sound of laws, policies, missions, and social consequences. And this definition set me up to pay attention to the ecology of prison music groups, bands, education, microeconomies, policy, administrative positions, media. And this helped me find something surprising. A vital jazz practice flourishing at the same time that Harry Oster, the folklorist who followed Lomax's footsteps in 1959, was occurring alongside his work songs and spirituals and blues that he had recorded. So I'll walk you through the beginning of the jazz renaissance in 1951, through the radical sounds of mid-60s jazz that lived alongside outlaw country, following massive budget cuts and a political scandal in 1958. And then on to bands you might not hear as jazz, but inherited the gains of jazz musicians that had developed before them and put to use after prisoner rights gains in 1974. It's not the whole history. For that, you have to read the book. But it'll show how musicians adapt to changes in Angola's mission and operation over time. So 1951. Often, a musical sound does not originate musically. A clenched muscle, an inhaled breath, an idea. In this case, it started in February 1951 with an act of self-mutilation. The Heel String Gang, as they would come to be known, was a group of white prisoners fed up with conditions at Angola. A few had been sent to the most powerless place on the farm, the Red Hat cell block at Camp E, reserved only for the most incorrigible. Prisoners competed with the rats for their dinner every night, and trustee guards threw leftovers from Camp E onto the floor of the dark cell. Inside, a solid steel door blocked the exit. The only other opening was a square foot opening near the ceiling. And Warden Easterly ran the prison with a firm hand and mind and was determined to step up his crackdown on the protests. And that evening, the prisoners at the Red Hat cell block acted together in protest. Waking up the following day, Nurse Margaret Daughtry had the unique task of reattaching 31 Achilles tendons. She fought off trustee guards attempting to exact punishment on the self-crippled protesters as she worked. And it was these trustee guards who might face trouble from Warden Easterly for the mass act of protest and the resulting loss of labor. As a result of national attention and political scandal, Angola's state penitentiary reached an inflection point with a pivotal change on the eve of a gubernatorial election marred by bad press over the slashing of heels. Angola was about to change, and so was the music. There was an influx of new funding, leadership, and a rehabilitative mission The legislator increased the prison's operating budget by $700,000 and an additional $250,000 for hiring professional guards. An unprecedented $4 million bond issue paved the way for building a modern facility instead of the old work camps. And Governor Kennan ushered a new era by appointing Warden Maurice Sigler, a professional federal penologist who was trained in the new penology. This innovative practice emphasized rehabilitation, allowing prisoners to self-organize under the premise that reform works better when prisoners are given degrees of liberty. While the new penology introduced fresh incentives, the lingering legacies of outlawry and slavery still cast long shadows, so we're leaving them there, still affecting Angola's transformation. 1952, Les Winslow, a 35-year-old multi-instrumentalist from Monroe, nearby Monroe, arrived on check fraud charges. Rumors swirled that he had once played with Bob Hope, and his extensive knowledge of big band music helped him form a jazz orchestra within the structures of reform. The reform initially impacted white prisoners, but change had a musical effect. Within a year of the heel-slashing incident, the white hillbilly bands of Camp E waned, and Winslow's jazz ensemble waxed. An influx of new arrivals from urban areas torn from the developing professional and industrial jobs fueled interest in contemporary jazz that aligned with the new rhetoric of rehabilitation. Winslow's band, the Cavaliers, became an audible example of reform, strategically supported by Warden Sigler for outside performances. And they toured the state until November 1953, when an opinion from Assistant Attorney General M.E. Culling stated, quote, "State laws fail to open gates for parish fairs, rodeos, and patriotic and hospital dances," effectively clipping the wings of Angola's burgeoning musical life. But a precedent was set. The travel ban was just a bump in the road. In the late 1950s, the Nicknacks emerged as the most important band at Angola, lasting until 1967 with rotating lineups. Initially led by Louis Sargent and Lester Thompson, the group formed at Camp A, the place that seemed untouched by the prison reform efforts. This is where Harry Oster had recorded a lot of the work songs he had collected. These decrepit buildings filled with vermin, with poor sanitation, housed hundreds of black prisoners who worked in the fields dawn to dusk. And despite the plantation-like conditions, the demographics of Camp A had shifted, with an influx of young urban prisoners, many of whom were professional musicians from New Orleans convicted on drug charges. Starting with no instruments, Sargent and Thompson eventually built the Nicknacks into Angola's most revered band. They earned the title of Warden Sigler's, the Warden's Band, and secured a busy performance schedule, including regular shows at the women's camp. No small feat. Their talent caught the attention of folklorist Harry Oster, who recorded the group in 1959, and though those tracks remain unreleased, I obtained copies from our Hooley records after reading about them in the Nicknacks and the Angolite. So listening to these recordings, I was astonished. They sounded nothing like the blues or the work songs and the spirituals that we typically associate with Angola. The short but prominent reverberation suggests a lively enclosed environment. The recordings, field recordings, not studio recordings, capture the imperfections and the aspirations of the musicians. Flub notes and uneven performances reveal a work in progress, a testament to the legacy of Les Winslow's music classes in Camp E that eventually made it to the whole population, including the Nicknacks. So as I listen, and I'll play a clip for you, I attune myself to the interactions among the musicians, the distinct personalities that emerge, and the various agendas at play. The arrangements showcase a range of abilities, sometimes exceeding the technical skills of the performers, but these flaws only highlight the group's ambition and determination. Each missed note is a reminder of what the Nicknacks were striving to achieve, a glimpse into the musical practice that they were creating within the prison. Oh, it's hard to turn off. It doesn't sound like Angola, and maybe that was the point. Another thing is, did you notice the bongos in there? That's a continuity. There's always some guy in prison who works his way into a band playing bongos. The metal band at the Baton Rouge prison had a bongo player. It was very bizarre. The reforms that had begun in 1951 with the heel string gang self-mutilation, hey, there we go, came to a halt and began to unravel in 1958. Warden Sigler's decision to staff his office with female prisoner, former stripper Penny Kent, provided ammunition for State Representative Lloyd Teakle to launch a campaign against Sigler. And the Teakle report, based on a 1957 visit, criticized Sigler's leadership and called for expanding Angola's plantation, supported, of course, by the local business owners. And despite Sigler's allies arguing that agricultural jobs were declining in Louisiana and that expansion would hinder rehabilitation, the campaign succeeded. Sigler resigned. So at this point, there's a shift. Musicians have built an institution. They're able to preserve it on their own. And as things shift, it shifts music. The post-1958 condition shifted things to outlawry. Free staff members left after Governor Davis slashed the prison budget by a third in 1962. Prisoner guards brutally supervised the fields, and support for education dried up. Music was left in the prisoners' hands. It didn't kill the music, it just shifted it. The second iteration of the Nicknacks brought an updated sound to Angola, infused with the political consciousness of black nationalism. That version was led by Charles Neville, who arrived at the prison in 1963. He was there 63 to 67 for 2 joints found on him while getting to a gig. Eventually, Neville took over leadership of the band after Lester Thompson's departure. And under Neville's guidance, the Nicknacks engaged jazz with a newfound intensity, taking advantage of the relative freedom afforded in the band room. It was in this space, largely free from administrative oversight, that the musicians taught each other advanced jazz techniques and theory. They spent countless hours jamming and experimenting, recreating the experimental atmosphere of the after-hours sessions that thrived in jazz clubs back home in New Orleans. Though performance opportunities were fewer than in the previous decade, the Nicknacks pushed the boundaries of their musical knowledge. The key moment came when Neville met John Probst. But this is worth an aside. Probst had these big, Neville described him as having these big Coke bottle glasses. He played on the avant-garde Dixieland scene before he was incarcerated. And they had assigned him to the field, to work in the field, even though he was legally blind, but they didn't believe legally blind. So he was reassigned to the band room when, in an attempt to cut Cain, he took a swing at a horse's leg, and they moved him out, and they moved him to the band room. So Probst introduced Neville to George Russell's groundbreaking book, the first written by a black scholar, The Lydian Chromatic Concept of Tonal Organization. I discovered this in college at Wesleyan. Neville discovered this in prison. As the band room clerk, Neville ordered a copy of the book, which had already influenced jazz giants such as Miles Davis, Bill Evans, John Coltrane, Art Farmer. The Lydian concept quickly became a cornerstone for the Nicknacks' approach to jazz as they explored its theoretical implications and incorporated its ideas into their improvisation and compositions. There was a summer where I got some of this. It's pretty heady stuff. So Neville also took over the music column at the Angolite, and Russell's book is very infused with it mixes political and music ideas. And here's a quote from one of Neville's columns where he is talking about the liberatory aspects of avant-garde jazz. Quote, "Coltrane's music is related to the mood of American Negroes, and particularly the just awakened and deeply frustrated young members of that group. Some performances should be heard, felt, and reflected upon by every American. For if there was a documentary film on the Watts riot, John Coltrane is the man to score it. So during this period, the scene was dominated by Neville, James Black, New Orleans piano virtuoso James Booker, who was fresh. James Black was fresh from touring with Yusuf Lateef and steeped in black nationalism and political jazz. And Leotha Brown, who I met at Angola 40 years later and was the member of the Nicknacks to die there. Their music provided a soundtrack to the struggle for rights. And as musicians, they were untouchable. The jazz era at Angola came to an end with a crackdown on the Black Panther Party, who were aligned with the Nicknacks and the musicians, resulting in a 2-year ban on music. But the legacy built from musicians from Winslow and Neville, from the Cavaliers to the Nicknacks, endured. And over the next 21 years, these musicians carved out spaces of collective freedom, joy, and possibility, navigating the complex interplay of outlawry, penance, and slavery that defined life at the prison. There's the Western Airs, not aligned with the Black Panthers. But the drummer had played in the jazz scene. He was a trumpet player, and then recognized his only gig was to form a country band. The country band didn't need a trumpet player, a bebop trumpet player. So he taught himself how to play drums on the bottom of his shoe, and ended up getting a sympathetic pardon from a governor after playing around town. As always, I filled my time, so let's just take it another shift. You can read about it in the book. These groups, I'll just say as an aside, Utopia Yorumba, Time Factor, and the Big River Band were groups that came out after the prison was desegregated. And so their job playing on the yard was to be able to play every style that somebody might like. Not just to appease them, but then they might get invited to play a banquet, and they'd get food, maybe even paid. Maybe they'd meet somebody from the outside who might help them. So these bands developed an impressive repertoire of being able to shift between styles mid-set, to pivot on a dime to be able to hit a crowd there. And I'll play 2 clips from a CD that they recorded in 1990, sometime in the early 90s. So this, to me, is like sort of their version of a Scared Straight. You remember that campaign? Don't do like me. You can hear it in their incorporation of pretty outdated rap at this point. But they're playing a gig. This was directed towards outside audiences. This got them out.
Sucker MC standing on the stage, reading from the book of life, but on the wrong page, telling you how they think it ought to be. Selling prefab ghetto philosophy, gold chains around their necks. They getting paid in full, they getting that paycheck. Only walked on video imagery, playing games with your identity. Red greed, envy, and jealousy, never showing what you really ought to see. Never stressing the real necessity to get an education. It's a mental stimulation, got to have an occupation. If you don't, you're gonna be true. Yeah, and the bottom line is not what you think you know, but what you can do. And if you still think it's cool to drop out of school, my brothers, don't be no fool, cause this is your life. This is your life.
You know, there was some white guy in the audience who was like, I love Eddie Van Halen too. Myron Hodges, who played that solo, here he is. He developed his styles, range of guitar styles, by, he already came in pretty talented, and he ended up joining the country band, learning how to play country music by not befriending the white musicians who played in there because they were all KKK members, but by listening outside the door and figuring out that if you played the same things down here in an open position, it sounded like country. So, in closing, the music is just one element of ways that people band together to find rights in prison. And you can see this list. Part of the argument is that through forming bands and developing relationships with the administration, you can get a space for a rehearsal room where you can close the door and lock it. You can have a guitar that is yours exclusive to use. You can choose who you want to be with, and you can get a guard to unlock the door. So in closing, as another commercial for the American Folklife Center here, why preserve this stuff? I asked the prisoners as I sent the manuscript, as it was under review from Oxford, I sent USPS into the prison. It got there in its big stack, and this is what I heard back, these comments. And I'll say, by preserving and sharing the music of Angola, we not only honor the legacy of these musicians, but also we enrich our understanding of the American experience. Their songs, their stories, and their struggles are a testament to the power of music to transcend the most difficult circumstances and to connect us all in our contentious, complex, and uneven shared musicality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Would you have time for a few questions?
I have all day for your questions. I don't know what time you have.
I would like. You talked about dawn to dusk work earlier on. I'm interested in the free time that these musicians had. It sounds pretty extensive in some cases. Can you comment, please?
Yeah, it depended on the time. So with the reforms, the institutions, there were several institutions that were built starting in the 1950s. So these are spaces where prisoners could get jobs. So the recreation department, the education department, the WLSP, a closed circuit radio station, the Angolite, the newspaper that starts after that. Those were all jobs that people could get if they had connections to, I mean, basically you're doing clerical work and things like that, organizing and being the point person to connect with the administration. But they're better than being in the field. And so Neville talked about when he was there in 1963, I mean, he's at the time like R&B jazz musician from New Orleans, and he finds himself in a field the next day because it was harvest season to pick cotton, and he was like, I don't know how to do this, and he got hit on the head by the back of an axe blade, or by the back of an axe for not knowing how. So for him, like the field wasn't a place for music. He didn't care about singing in there. He just tried to get out. So he, through connections, ended up replacing Lester Thompson's position there and running the band room. So he was essentially a clerk. When James Black arrived, he did everything he could do to get Black out of the field to join the band room and get a job in there too. And it took a while, but he just recognized, you know, he was like, here's this guy coming in like, all Muslim and political and stuff, he's not going to last in this place. And so he really protected him by bringing them in. So for most people, they had to wait till the end of work, and then they could come in. So that would vary at what time, and then they'd spend the evenings in the band room. But for anybody who had a job that could give them access to it, then they would have access to play. And then that's the basic model, but it's sort of shifted over time for that.
Were people musicians when they, so you had prisoners who were musicians when they came in. Mm-hmm. Was there any opportunity for someone who wasn't a musician to learn an instrument? Yeah, and it's, you know, I don't know, I love music, but I don't have a lot of patience for listening to somebody starting guitar. It's like, or any instrument. When I was in California, I met these guys teaching themselves violin. And they have, at Soledad Prison, they have this one room where all the musicians get 2 hours a week in there. And even those poor violinists, none of the musicians wanted them in the room, so they'd practice out in the hallway. So I didn't spend a lot of time with learners, but the people who were learning when I was there were in the recreation department. So the same guy who checked out basketballs for that would check out guitars, and he didn't really know. So you had a lot of people who were self-teaching. But people like Leotha Brown, who I met, he was like a schooled musician when he came in. He knew how to read music, he knew how to play off of that. He didn't know how to do jazz. So his school
to learn how to play jazz was being in the Nicknacks. And his stories were amazing, where he would say, like, they'd show up to a gig and the musician and all the other bandmates had like hid his music so he didn't have anything to read. And then he'd be like, "Where's my music?" And they'd all laugh. And then, or they'd say like, "Okay, on 4, we're all gonna come in. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then they'd sit out and leave him up there hanging and stuff. So it was really like they were throwing him in the deep end for that. So more learning happened on that level where people came in with a certain style. Like a lot of R&B singers turned to gospel when they were there as they got older, and also saw more opportunities in it. But the one guy, this bass player, Laird Vayon, who's pretty active, he'd been there for 20 years, he learned when he was in prison. And he had the story that kind of opened me up to this idea that musicians just will make music. And he said when he asked somebody to teach him how to play bass, the guy warned him and he said, "I just want you to know what you're getting into. It'll take over your life. You won't be able to think about anything else." And he made this connection to like drug addiction, of like, you will do that. And he said, that little guy was right. Now I listen to the radio and I'm just thinking of like theoretical structures and the key changes and stuff like that. And so I focused much more on that learning after than it's. And then the last thing I'll say is, I've heard that it's very hard to learn in prison because when you're learning music, it often involves some criticism. And it's very hard for a lot of people who've suffered going through a trial and suffered the kind of like massive criticism that comes with that, to be able to hear somebody say like, "You're playing that wrong," or "Your fingering is off," or something like that.
Oh, thanks. That was great. Thank you. I was wondering in your research if you found that, musicians just want to play, right? And outside of prison, they have quite a bit of status and celebrity. In prison, did it seem that the other prisoners gave them that same thing, or is it more animosity towards the freedoms that they got?
It's a good question, and that was, yeah, so in other words, like, does music keep you safe? The short answer is like, no. It doesn't. They were still subject to, we romanticize that a lot, and it would seem. There are some like young people who are doing it who would get respect from other people in the same way that like in projects, somebody is like going to school and doing really well. Community members will be like, "Oh, you're gonna get out of here, you're gonna do that." So there were a lot of accounts of like younger musicians being like kind of protected by the old musicians who were just trying to support them to get out and things. But Neville put it this way. I asked him, I was still struck with this romantic idea that like music's gonna like have this like protective armor through the respect that they had. And he said, "No, being in the band just meant that I had muscle. I would walk around with my bandmates and we were tough. We could fight." And he said, "Some people couldn't fight, and so we'd bring them in and we'd protect them. But that's not unlike any other clique that was out there." So I'd say it was a little of both, that it's not a fail-safe for protection, but it did help people distinguish themselves. And I think importantly, it helped people band together. It helped people to form communities and form stable relationships that they could rely on, that were predictable. Yeah.
We have time for one more
Sure.
question.
Thank you so much for your presentation. That was really quite illuminating. And you've expanded my notion of what music in prisons mean. And I guess I go back to the stereotypical notion I had, which was the prison songs are tied to work time discipline, right? And like actually doing work, physical, manual labor, hoeing the fields, chopping down trees. And what is the place of that kind of work song in the sort of in the contemporary moment? Where does that land?
Right, like has that survived is your question? It survived I followed that, and that's one of the kind of sub-themes in the book. I keep going back to the field because like it's still a plantation. Like there's still that aspect. Yes, that book. That book that you could get for 30% off. Yeah, so I go back there, and some of the things, there are a few changes. One is that, Lomax was an interesting guy, and he had a particular agenda. He wanted to get songs that were disappearing. And so he was trying to find things that didn't have links to contemporary music, which was jazz then. I'm sure you know this. But what I found is that that in the field they were using whatever tools they had, and they weren't necessarily interested. Some were interested in the older songs, but these were guys who were in the fields like in the 80s, and they would meet somebody who was like a generation or half a generation up, and they'd be like, this guy knows B.B. King songs. So they were using a lot of, like I heard, like Kool and the Gang was very popular. Lionel Richie even was sung in the fields. And what they would do is take these songs, in the book I say it's like kind of using, it's like the equivalent of using a butter knife as a screw, as a screwdriver. You know, it works, but it's not the best tool for it. So they would bring that stuff in gospel songs and kind of use it in a lot of the same ways, but the repertoire was different. Nowadays, it's mostly rap in the fields. But they're also not doing the kind of coordinated, like more semi-skilled labor. Now they're doing basically stoop work of uncoordinated. So, you know, if you could imagine like virtuosic rap at like in the fields that like Bruce Jackson or Lomax or Oster were recording, they'd be worn out by like mid-morning. You know, there was something to, like, hip-hop is very important and rap is very important, but Angola, it's much more of a solo sport. And it's probably more in the lines of what a field holler was before, yeah.
Maybe one more question.
Okay.
Yes, I saw in the photos something I was surprised at. There were some integrated bands earlier than I would have expected.
Mm-hmm.
When did that begin? How did it come about? How did it work? Because you had said it was very segregated.
Yeah, 1954, there was a guy named Adrian Bellum, and he was a white guy who was active in New Orleans. And actually, I was just stumbled on some research and realized this guy he collaborated with, a magician, that he got busted for weed. When he was working out a musical accompaniment for a magic show in New Orleans. And then I just ran across the magician's name in there too. So they reunited at Angola to do this. But Bellum was interesting because Bellum just wanted to play jazz. And there wasn't jazz on that level of like bebop happening at Camp E, which was the white camp where he was. So he would wait until musicians came through and did these inter-camp tours. And he'd be invited on stage with them. And eventually he was able to form a group called the All-Stars that was the first integrated group. 54, yeah. And so he's playing, but that didn't last too long. But there also Russell Sweet, who became the drummer of the Western Airs and formed that group. He was a trumpet player who'd played in New York and had played I can't remember, one of the first band leaders who had integrated their jazz band. So, like these musicians, and he's from New York, so he's like, I don't belong anywhere. Might as well play with the jazz musicians. But there was crossover in that direction of white musicians going into bebop bands. But you never had like a black musician joining a hillbilly group or something like that. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
I want to. I'm afraid we're going to have to wind it down now. Please join me in thanking Professor Harper for coming.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming. Also, next week, the American Folklife Center is presenting the group Windborne on Thursday night at 7 o'clock here at the library, so please come back for that. And we'll have more lectures and concerts in the coming months. So watch our website, or if you're on our mailing list. If you're not on our mailing list, you can correct that by going to our website and adding your name. Thank you all so much for coming.